In Chapter 5, we're going to use the active voice. We're going to practice being active, inclusive, and professional in our writing. When you're thinking about putting a document together, you want to start with the tone or the look or feel of that document that you're trying to achieve. Active voice is a really important part of that. But you can think of it as deciding what to wear. Are you trying to come across in a casual way, or are you trying to come across in a more professional way? And depending on your audience and the purpose of the content you're creating, you're going to make different choices. So again, there's no one right way to do this or one choice that's always better than the other. You do have to use judgment and discretion as you are working through all of these elements of plain language. When you're thinking about your tone, again, are you being formal or informal? Are you going for a conversational approach? If so, it might be because you're really trying to connect with somebody and listen to them and hear what it is they have to say. Sometimes, however, we are directing people. We may be telling them how to go about getting a particular service, or that an initiative has happened and here's how it's going to impact them. That might be a slightly more formal communication. But whatever you're doing, whether you're assisting somebody or you're simply informing them, you want to think about your audience using those personas that you developed, what their needs are, what the media is that you're going to use to communicate this message, and then how it is you want to create that right first impression with your content. If you take a look at these purchasing card ground rules, I want you to ask yourself how you feel reading them. Think about how just the look of the document is affecting you. And as you begin to read through the document, the first line, the purchasing card, is to be used for legitimate business purposes only. Almost makes me feel like maybe they suspect I'm not going to do something legitimate. And this very formal, stuffy language is also creating a barrier in my mind. It will be used only when all of the following conditions exist. It feels a little hard, a little directive. And then it lists a bunch of conditions and, we will review your use and we reserve the right to revoke the privileges. Again, it's a pretty directive document. So as the user, as the person who's trying to understand what I'm allowed to do with my purchasing card, which is also a jargon term, I'm beginning to feel like maybe they don't trust me. That may not be what you want to have happen when you create a document. That was an example that our plain language took the opportunity to talk to the folks who'd created it and the folks who were using it and really understand what is the purpose of this document, and then to create a better revision. That's one of the first things you can do when you're trying to think about your document as a whole, is really ask somebody, how does this make you feel when you read it? Because that's that first impression, and a lot of that has to do with the tone and the word choices that you're using. So again, we have an interactive exercise for you. This is a short one. So go ahead and pause your video and see what you can do about choosing a different tone for the sentence that you see on your screen. It may have taken you a little while to read through that sentence and really deconstruct the meaning, and that goes back to the last chapter. There are a lot of technical terms in here. There is some language that could really be simplified. And, it's a little bit twisty. In some ways, we were all rewarded for writing sentences like that, for writing in more complex, lengthier ways through our academic careers. I remember one time talking to my kids about plain language and how we were starting to use it at work. And one of my kids summarized it as, so it's basically everything we were taught to do in school, not to do that. And I had to laugh, but it's kind of true. You're rewarded in one system for being more complex and more complicated, but really out in the real world, we are trying to get our information across. If you want to write a complex, lengthy novel, you should definitely go for it. But when you're trying to get some information across to somebody who just wants to know what to do in their stormwater design manual, you want to simplify like this example. So really, that long sentence is just trying to say, when two options are available in the design manuals, we may require the more restrictive one. It's as simple as that. But you can see how it took a while to break it down for your own experience there, and how that first example is very stuffy, it's bureaucratic, and it puts a barrier up. But the second example is much more direct, and now as the person reading the design manual, I understand what it is I need to do. Let's talk about passive voice. This is something that is sometimes hard to spot at first, but once you really internalize what it is, then it becomes much easier to find and eliminate from your own writing. Once in a while, it's going to be useful or appropriate, but most of the time you can turn passive voice into an active voice. And I think of active voice as who did what when. Just tell me who's doing the action, and that's the active voice. Sometimes this is hard when you're operating in the public eye because it feels like you're putting yourself out there. You're really owning what happened. You're saying, our department made this decision, or our department made this recommendation. Our group thinks this is the best course of action. But it's better to be direct and keep your subject and your verb close, and let's talk about who is doing what. The reason for this goes back to trust again. When you are evasive, which is what passive language sounds like, then it's hard for people to know who's doing what, and it undermines the trust that you're trying to build. So classic is mistakes were made. And the implication, of course, is, but not by me. And you know how it is when you're reading something, you're trying to figure out who do I go to ask a question, who did this? You're trying to understand who took the action. It's really important to be able to be direct with your stakeholders or the folks you're communicating with and let them know so they can really understand what's happening around them. So you want to avoid that passive voice, that sort of evasive voice, and be direct, but how do you know if you're using the active voice? I borrowed this example from Steven Pinker. He talks about zombie nouns, and it's kind of funny, but if you don't know who did it, it could have been done by zombies. So if you find yourself in that situation where it's just not clear who took the action or who's going to do something, and it could have been done by zombies, you're probably using the passive voice. So if you come across something like your cooperation is greatly appreciated, by zombies, I don't know who's appreciating. A work order was created as a result of your call. I don't really know if I have a question, who to reach out to. It could have been anybody. So tell them you did it. Tell them who to talk to. We appreciate your cooperation, especially if you're assigning a name to it or there's you're on a web page and I know who we are. We created a work order after you called. That's a really nice, direct, active sentence. You called us and we did something about it. So you can see how that's much more conversational and direct than a work order was created as a result of your call. One of the ways you can identify the passive voice is when you have these clusters of nouns that really should be a verb. So in this next interactive exercise, you can pause your video and do your best to turn these clusters of nouns back into verbs. These may be very, very familiar phrases to you and things that you've either written or come across on a regular basis. And so when you find something that says, establish a requirement, that can be as simple as require. See how we've turned that into a straight out verb. Give consideration to can become consider or evaluate. Give recognition to is just recognize. Issue an approval becomes approve. Make a determination becomes determine. Make a recommendation becomes recommend. And you can begin to see how this pattern is easy to identify in your own writing once you get used to it. So submit an application, apply. Issue a denial, it just becomes deny. Provide information. You can tell somebody, you can inform them. That comes up a lot in meetings or engagement exercises. So just be really direct about what you're trying to do. Deliver a statement becomes say or tell or just deliver. Make a payment can become pay. And take action is something that can be pretty vague and also indirect. You want to just tell people what the action actually is, or just use the word act. So those are some good ways to start to think about the active voice. In the next interactive exercise, you're going to have a chance to put it all together. So you can go ahead and pause your video and try to turn this set of noun clusters into an active sentence. So that sentence actually came from a letter that was sent to our housing residents on a regular basis. And it began with an inspection of your apartment for monitoring and extermination for household pests by a representative from Curtis Pest Control has been scheduled for the following dates. That's a lot of language to say something as simple as Curtis Pest Control will visit your apartment on the following dates. And this was something, a great example of a communication that was being sent out on a pretty regular basis, and someone had drafted it years ago, and they were simply reusing it over time. And with fresh eyes, our team was able to look at it and realize that it had a lot of passive voice, that we didn't really need to be redundant about the monitoring and extermination because Curtis Pest Control is pretty clear about what they are going to be there doing. And instead of that has been scheduled, which is that passive voice again, we just want to tell them who Curtis Pest Control is going to visit your apartment on this date. Much more clear, much more direct. Also a good example of where this communication was being translated. It's much simpler and direct to translate the new sentence than it would have been to translate the old one. Another part of tone is really thinking about using inclusive language. And this, again, ties back to understanding your audience. You want to be aware of the cultural, social, and political context of your audience. And you want to be mindful of the language you're using and the tone of your message. A fundamental tool you can use is to just be respectful and ask. Don't assume. This is a place where you want to focus on the person or the audience and their achievements. You want to make sure that your headlines and your images and your graphics are all fair and responsible in their depiction of people of color and a coverage of issues. And use racial and ethnic identification when it is pertinent. If it's necessary to mention someone's race, ask them how they prefer to be identified. And when talking about a specific individual, use the name they ask you to use. Don't ask to use a nickname. These are some really basic general guidelines that you can use when you start to think about inclusive language. And again, because language is living and it changes and we're having conversations every day about inclusivity and accessibility, you want to really think about how to have this conversation in your community, how to be respectful. And again, it goes back to talking to your audience and really engaging with them on how best to communicate and how they would like things to be written and shared with them. Sometimes it's hard to know which language, what kind of language to use. So again, ask people what they prefer. You don't want to exclude or make people invisible by using language that demeans or trivializes people. And so that's really at the heart of using inclusive and accessible language. And it's okay to recognize that not everybody agrees on terminology. Language is living, it's changing. And so again, asking your audience how they wish to be spoken to is the most powerful tool you can use. You can find information and other guidelines online that will help you drill down into some of the specifics of using inclusive language. But again, it's important because this goes back to the trust building and connecting with your audience, and it is part of the tone that you're setting in any of your communications. That's it for Chapter 5, and in the next chapter, we're going to start bringing a lot of this together and thinking about once you've mastered the words and your tone and being direct in your language, how do you organize your work to get your content across to your audience?